Hey everyone, Dan here. You've probably noticed over the last couple of weeks, not as much Andrew. Do not fret, he has not gone anywhere. We touched on this a few episodes back, but we moved around some of his duties here at Deviant, and part of that is working ahead. And while you've been hearing me tell stories over the last few weeks, he's been working on stories for the future, and that future is now. So Andrew is back this week, and for the next couple of weeks, we've got a new case and a new story that we're starting, and it's a case he's actually been pretty deeply immersed in for quite a while now. It's the story of the Hart family murders, and there are parts of this that can be difficult to listen to, but it's a pretty fascinating story. And as always, we're going to be putting more ways that you can see and experience this story up on Patreon and our social. Our Patreon you can find at deviantpodcast.com, and it starts at the cost of free. And on social, we're on TikTok, we're on Instagram at deviant.podcast. Make sure to check us out in all those places. So you've heard enough of me for these past few weeks. I'm going to shut up now and hand it off to Andrew Iden with the brand new Deviant Exploration.
In November of 2014, America's in a tough spot. The police shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, has become a flashpoint, a sort of powder keg of anger, outrage, and frustration. And all three of those, the anger, outrage, and frustration, isn't just isolated to Ferguson. It's spread to a lot of other places: Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and out west in San Francisco, and in the Pacific Northwest, like Portland, Oregon.
And so we had the incident halfway across the United States, but it resonates all the way to the West Coast.
That's Brett Barnum. For more than 34 years, he's been a police officer in Portland.
Our folks, and when I say our folks, our community members, were wanting to vent their frustrations about this incident. You know, what they see in the media, see on the news, what they hear from family and friends that may live on the East Coast or the Midwest, really frustrates them and angers them.
If there's a city where protests are a way of life and police are trained to handle them, it's going to be Portland.
Oftentimes we say protest, but often these things in Portland, they're just free speech events. At that free speech event, myself and a colleague of mine, we decided, we heard on the radio, hey, we need a couple of motors to block it. So myself and one of my motor partners, Brian Sweeney, we took off and we went to block the street. And it was simply low key, block it at the crosswalk, make sure cars turn in a different direction. You don't have to listen to the speech material. You don't have to engage the crowd, but we just want the crowd to have a safe place to participate.
And the crowd is pretty good size. Phones, cameras, signs, they're all out. And things aren't really turning violent, at least not yet anyway. But like most cities across the country at the time, the tension is very real. And Sergeant Barnum, well suited for events like this, notices something. A few feet away, there's a young African-American boy, about 11 years old, and he's just sort of standing there.
But I looked over at his face, and he was crying. And he was kind of looking over towards Brian and I go, hey, Brian, is that kid over there crying? Is he lost? We didn't know if he was lost. We didn't know if he was scared. And so as we sat there, basically we just had our motorcycles on the kickstands, and we're just kind of sitting there, and I messaged for him to come on over. And, gave him the finger, so to speak, to come on over here. And we started chatting a little bit. He came over. I go, hey, is everything okay? And he didn't say much at the beginning. And I said, are you okay? Are you lost? And he said, no. And so we had a little bit more conversation, but I could tell he was in a little bit of distress.
And it's not just the young boy. With him in the heart of the Portland protest, amongst all the madness, is the rest of his family and one of his moms with her phone in hand.
She was standing back a little bit. I noticed she was taking some pictures. There were also some other people standing around watching us talk, and they're taking pictures with their phones, and a couple other, it seemed to be professional photographers, probably with media. I didn't pay them any attention. I wanted to engage and be eye to eye and have a direct conversation with this child who seemed to be struggling. There was clearly some barriers, some nervousness on his part at this point. So what do? We talk about vacations. We talk about kid things. What do you do? Where do you go to school? He told me he was homeschooled. And we had this back and forth conversation about things in his life, not in my life, things in his life. We talked about vacations, and he said they went on a vacation earlier this last summer. They went to the beach. They had a great time. They often travel as a family together. He told me he had lots of sisters and brothers. And so we just had a great conversation. It lasted maybe about 10 or so minutes. And there was a natural break in the conversation, and I could see his mom was kind of done taking pictures. And at the time, I didn't know it was mom. But it was just a good time to kind of call the conversation over. Hopefully, I impacted this young man a little bit in a positive way. And he kind of put his head down. And I said, "Hey, are you okay?" And he says, "Yeah, I'll be fine." And then I looked at his sign.
In the thick of the protest, with the chants, the call and response, and the hundreds of people, the boy was holding a black placard with 5 words: "Free hugs, pass it on."
And I looked down and I pointed down to it and I said, "Hey, can I have one of those?" And he looks down at the sign, he looks back up at me, and he starts crying, and we locked arms. We had a hug. And that's where it all took off. Most impactful day of my career. I can remember that day clearly. I've got it marked in my calendar and my phone as the day that forever kind of changed my life.
The exact moment that boy leaned in to hug Sergeant Barnum, one of the photographers covering the protest, Johnny Nguyen, caught it on film. And in that photo, there's Sergeant Barnum leaning in and hugging the young boy. And the young boy has tears on his face. It's sort of the perfect picture. Framing, composition, everything. And that encounter and that photo, a white police officer in Portland and a young African-American boy embracing, becomes a really big deal.
This picture resonating with so many people because it captures just the power and the hope that despite everything that is going on, that so many people you have around here.
A touching photo of a white police officer embracing an African-American boy has gone viral.
Our PIO, our press information officer for the Portland Police Bureau, a gentleman I got hired with, Pete Simpson. Pete's a good friend of mine. Pete called me. I remember his conversation, clear as day. He said, "Hey, Brett, did you hug a kid yesterday?" And I go, "Well, yeah, I just got done talking with Kelly." And he goes, "Hold on." And I go, "What do you mean, hold on? This is going to be a deal." And I said, "What?" He goes, "I saw the image." I said, "What image?" He goes, "There was a semi-professional photographer who took a picture of you hugging this kid. They want to know if they can release it to the Oregonian, and which is our local newspaper, our local newsprint. But they want your permission." And I said, "Well, can I see it?" So he emails it to me. I go, "Whoa."
In the days that follow, it seems to go around the world. It's finding every corner of the internet and social media.
The likes and clicks and everything else just started skyrocketing. And about every hour you could look at the photo on the Oregonian or a Facebook page or something like that. And it's up to like 10,000. Now it's 25,000. Now it's just going rampant. And I went, uh-oh, this is going to mean something. People are going to want my time. And that's okay, but I'm going to be busy for a little bit.
It's becoming a symbol of all the country is trying to achieve at that point. A kind of middle ground between the narrative surrounding police and overly aggressive tactics and civilians who are taking to the streets to make their voices heard.
That's what the country needed at the time. That's what police agencies needed at the time. There's a big message here, and it's like, cops do this. This is what they do. The message needed to be said. I wanted people to feel what I felt if they could. And so I asked Pete if there was any possibility, our PIO, if he could reach out to the family. The family was getting inundated with calls, but they went silent. They wanted nothing to do with the media. They were tired of them camping out on their front door.
6 months after that image is taken, and after it had gone around the world on social media, Brett sits down to write a message to the mother of the boy in that photo.
I sent her a very nice message saying, "Hey, If I have created a rub, I apologize, but I would love an opportunity to sit down with you and just say how impactful this was to me. So if you want to meet at a Starbucks or at a coffee shop where they were from, which was a town 5 miles from where I live, maybe we can meet up for coffee. I could tell she read the message by the little indicator in the corner, but she never replied back. And then eventually she shut down her Facebook because they got so overwhelmed.
But that image is not at all what it appears to be. It's not about unity. It's not about an image of racial reconciliation. And it's not about two different perspectives colliding in one photograph. Because 4 years later, the boy in that photo will be dead. And so will his 5 siblings and his 2 mothers. 4 years later, the entire story of that boy, his family, and all that they seem to represent is completely rewritten. The photo, in a number of ways, redefines the notion of what we think, what we know, and what we see, and how often there is a huge difference between all three. We're all wired differently. Some of us are wired for good, some of us are wired for bad. But a select few step outside all of society's boundaries. From cold open media, this is Deviant, the Hart family homicides, part 1. It's hard to overstate how beautiful the cliffs near Westport, California are. Along Highway 1, part of the Pacific Coast Highway, it's the kind of thing you see in a commercial. You know, somebody driving a convertible just before sunset, wind in their hair. And if you're heading south, out the passenger side window is the Pacific Ocean. And at about 6 p.m., the sun's going down, and the way that light skips off the waves is awesome. And out the driver's side window, mountains, thick woods that open up to the beach. All along the way, there's turnouts, small gravel lots where the tourists stop. Once in a while, an RV parks here for a few days before Mendocino County deputies knock on the door to say, hey, time to move it along. Those turnouts are where the cliffs dive about 70, 80 feet to the beach below, and the water slaps onto the rocks, and the wind is pretty intense. One of those turnouts along Highway 1 is a small area known as Juan Creek, which flows under a bridge and out into the Pacific Ocean. It is something. And the bridge that goes over Juan Creek leads right to one of those turnouts.
My name is Tom Allman, and I have recently retired from law enforcement after just at 39 years in law enforcement. And I was elected 4 terms in Mendocino County.
And on March 26th, 2018, Sheriff Tom Allman is in nearby Mendocino.
I was driving a radio car, and so I heard the deputies get dispatched to a multi-fatality traffic accident in the northwest part of our county, just north of a small little village called Westport. And I was in the town of Mendocino, which was about 35 miles away. And in our county, 35 miles away means you're real close.
I work in the county seat at the time, which is Ukiah, and that's approximately probably an hour and a half from the scene. But it was about between 4 and 5 p.m. I normally go off at 5.
That's Shannon Barney. He's retired now, living in Montana, but in 2018, he's a lieutenant working alongside Sheriff Allman.
We got a notice coming in through emergency dispatch of a mass casualty incident in the area of Juan Creek, and a mass casualty incident generally refers to 5 or more injured or deceased persons. It was reported as a traffic accident at the Juan Creek Bridge pullout, where there were believed to be 2 adults and potentially 5 children deceased at the scene.
So I responded up there. And so I got there, in about 40 minutes. And we had one deputy, Deputy Julian was on scene, and the fire department, Westport Volunteer Fire Department, was on scene. I parked my truck and I walked toward the edge of the ocean. I looked down and I saw this large GMC SUV. The waves were just moving back and forth and back. It was just rocking this SUV back and forth, and no bodies had been recovered yet.
We get cars over the cliff all the time. I mean, that's not unusual. We have a lot of storms, a lot of rocky roads, a lot of, not well marked roads. So that's not abnormal. And it's not abnormal to have, coroner's cases come out of terrible accidents in the roads. What was totally unusual was to have potentially 5 deceased people.
As soon as I walked up and, people said, "Hey, Sheriff, let me tell you what's going on." And I was talking to the fire chief there, and I saw firemen with rappel harnesses on, and they were rappelling down I'm going to guess 70 foot, maybe 60 to 70 foot bank. Fire chief just came over and said, "There's kids involved, Sheriff. There's kids that are dead in there."
The kids were 19-year-old Marcus Hart and his siblings, 14-year-olds Jeremiah and Abigail. And in the front seat, the mothers, Sarah and Jennifer. Unaccounted for at the time is 12-year-old Sierra, who was found more than a week later, 16-year-old Hannah, whose remains were found 10 months later, and 15-year-old Devante, the boy in the picture, who to this day remains missing.
I don't know that I've ever had a case involving that many people before. I did have one years ago with a plane crash, but that was 4 people. To have all 5 deceased, that was unusual for us.
That's not something that you can just hear and stand around. When kids are involved, you're immediately connected to the scene, because kids are involved. We're going to be notifying parents. We're going to be dealing with a high profile case. I mean, all these things are going through my mind because a child's death really and truly is different than, I hate to say, a typical traffic fatality, because that's downplaying fatalities, because every fatality is important. But you understand what I'm saying? When adults are involved, all right, there's usually alcohol or speeding or who knows what involved. But when kids are involved in a fatal incident, accident, situation, you just have this immediate feeling of innocence being taken away.
I remember the feeling. It was kind of I don't want to say we're calloused when we do our investigations, but let's face it, there's sometimes cops being cops. There's a lot of joking around, a lot of, stupidity really is what it is. It's how you deal with stress, and it's how you cope with all the things you look at. But there was none of that, and that was odd for me, because that's not like cops. And there was a lot of us there, and we were all kind of in awe, kind of worried about what this potential case was.
I didn't want to just stand there and look. And so one of the things that I did is I got my cell phone out, and and I'm really, really glad I did this. I just started taking pictures.
You're hearing a lot about CHP. That's the California Highway Patrol.
I took a picture of the CHP helicopter, which had just arrived. And then a really important picture I took, and I took it totally not knowing the importance of it, is I walked back to the highway, so State Highway 1, and I took a picture from the pavement due west to where the car went off the bluff. And so the reason that is so significant is because that picture was very important to show that there was no strange driving marks on the gravel. There weren't any skid marks, there weren't acceleration marks, it was just, when I look at that picture now, I just look and say, gosh, it's as if somebody just left State Highway 1 pavement and just drove across this maybe 100-foot level gravel turnout and just went off the bluff. I think it was around day 3 that the CHP captain and I were having this conversation, and we were looking at everything that his officers had done, and we were looking at what my deputies and the detectives had learned.
One of the early things that really bothered CHP, though, was there were no clear indications that anybody tried to stop. As if you're coming down the highway and you accidentally either fall asleep or you lose, control somehow, or you get distracted and you accidentally start to run off the road. Almost all of our instincts is to slam on the brakes and try to correct. And there were really no signs of that at the scene at all, which started to be concerning right away.
It was around that time that we started putting this train on the track to say, maybe this was an accident. And so the CHP captain and I had a conversation, and I think it was on day 4. And day 4 was where I said, it is my opinion that this has shifted from an accident to a criminal act.
We're starting to get at least a picture of where this family was before this horrible accident. Is that helping you in any way to figure out why the accident happened and where those 3 missing kids are?
Well, it's certainly helping us determine the route. I'm to the point where I no longer am calling this an accident. I'm calling it a crime.
It's just one of those things that the more we looked at it, the more it became obvious, especially to the trained accident investigators, that it was probably an intentional act.
We didn't come to that conclusion haphazardly. We didn't come to it quickly. We came to it by really and truly considering the facts.
There were 2 things that really kind of hit home. Is the onboard computer, kind of a black box, if you will, was downloaded, and the investigators found that the vehicle had parked for a short period of time, and then when it started up, it went to 100%, and then eventually more once it left the cliff. But it went to 100% acceleration, no braking, but absolute acceleration. Somebody just slammed their foot to the floor on the acceleration pedal and got as much speed as they could.
When the car actually went airborne and the foot was on the accelerator, then at that point, the tires started, they didn't have any friction whatsoever because they weren't touching anything.
Once you lose traction and the vehicle becomes airborne, as it was explained to us, once a vehicle becomes airborne, there's no physical anything stopping the wheels. And so they gain rapid speed really quickly. And that's what it showed on there, is that whoever had it was just floored the whole time.
They were spinning at 90 or 100 miles an hour. But I don't think the car was doing that kind of speed across a parking lot, because that picture that I took when I got there would have shown, strewn gravel, acceleration marks, and so forth.
The discovery of the gold GMC Yukon, rocking back and forth on those rocks while the water splashes around it, is one thing. But the determination that this is an intentional, deliberate act is something different altogether.
Those were not easy words to even ponder, let alone say, because once you cast that stone, if there is a innocent alibi or innocent reason where this happened, the fact that the sheriff of the county said this may be a criminal act has tainted the innocence there.
When you have 3 outstanding children, that heightens it a little bit more pressure to see what we can do to maybe try to find them quicker, find out what we can do. You have to say, this is a possibility. This is a possibility. A possibility could be there with friends or neighbors or something like that. And there is also a possibility that they're lost in the sea.
Working with Sheriff Allman and Lieutenant Barney to try and determine all of this is Detective Rob Julian.
He sent me some emails kind of throughout the night as he conducted his investigation. We had one identification of Sarah on a driver's license that was located in the car. We didn't have a lot of information on them. But what he was able to discover through his research is he found out about Devante and the Hart family having kind of gone viral with a post where Devante ended up at a kind of a Black Lives Matter protest in Portland, and he ended up having a sign that says free hugs. Deputy Julian, he informed me in an email that I probably should be aware thankfully, of the press interest that might come from this case, as well as the public interest, and that he advised me that we had 3 thought to be at that time children, 2 adults, and that with the size of the family, there could be an additional 3 children outstanding. And so I called Sergeant Barnum in Portland.
It was an early morning. I was at work, just got into my office, and I got a phone call. I didn't recognize the number, and I took the call, and it was a lieutenant from the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office.
And I asked him if he knew where they lived, the family, and he told me that he had attempted to stay in contact with them, but they didn't really stay in contact with him, and he wasn't sure where they were.
And so as I'm talking to the lieutenant, he says, "Hey, do you have any forwarding contact information for the Hart family? I know that because of the iconic photo that we've had that went viral, I just thought I'd reach out to you because do you have any contact with the Hart family at all?" I said, "Why? What's up?" And then he told me the news. He says, "Well, we've got their car and we've got a couple of the siblings." And he says, "We're trying to find a contact information for Jennifer or Sarah. We have pulled both of them out of the car. The car went off a cliff." He told me the whole story about kind of how it all happened. And he goes, "We're still putting together the pieces." He says, "It looks like they purposely drove off the freeway at a lookout point on 101. And I said, "Oh, no." And he goes, "We've recovered X amount of people so far, but we still have 3 that are unaccounted for. And so we're searching for them. And one of them is Deviant." And I explained to him, I said, "The last I knew, they lived in West Lynn." But he goes, "No, they actually lived up in North Clark County." So then the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office did their wonderful work of piecing this together and putting the story together for everybody to clearly understand what happened.
West Lynn is a suburb of Portland, and the Harts had lived there, and we'll get to that. But what Shannon Barney, Detective Julian, and Sheriff Allman, and all the rest of the agencies working on this case were piecing together was the Harts' winding route through the Pacific Northwest.
From the night they left their house, they went kind of northwest over to the coast of Washington, hit Highway 1/101, and then just kind of skipped down the highway headed south. They would stop periodically and pullouts and things like that. So what we try to do is have agencies that were in those areas go take a look around those pullouts where they would stop if we could narrow down where they were. We did have an address from the vehicle out in Woodland, Washington, which is about probably a half an hour north of Portland. So kind of a suburb area of Portland, and they lived out there.
Out there is the Portland suburb of Woodland, Washington. And suburb may be actually a generous phrase here. It's more of a town sitting along the Lewis River, next to what's known as Horseshoe Lake. And if you're there on a sunny day in the 70s like I was, it's beautiful. And the Hart family house is up a country road on the edge of town. And after turning right onto a gravel driveway, it sits just at the top of a hill to the right. There's raised garden beds outside, chicken coops. It's sort of what you think of when you imagine the woods and country of Washington State.
And I requested a welfare check at the house. I believe the sergeant and one deputy went out, conducted the welfare check, said there was really no signs of any foul play. There was no indication of where the children might be. But he said there were some pets, like a cat and some baby chickens and some other things in the house, and it looked like they just left. There was a lot of belongings there. It's not like they packed up and left. It was just the family was gone.
The story of the Hart family and all that comes with it ended at the majestic cliffs of Mendocino County, the PCH, and those foamy waters of the Pacific 70 feet below. How this story and how it got to that cliff, literally and metaphorically, is a long and complicated path. And we're going to follow that path in our next few episodes. A story that in a number of ways is a paradox. A biracial family, adopted children, married moms. They were a portrait of joy, love, and the pursuit of social justice.
They were so adorable, and so friendly, and they were giving hugs, and I was just like, what is this? This is so unusual and great at the same time.
That's what it seems like anyway. The sobering reality is actually quite different. The reality says they are mothers who neglect their children, withholding food, punishing them severely.
She physically took them into a room, made them lie flat on their backs on the floor for almost, I believe it was like 6 hours.
We didn't know everything then that we know now. We didn't know about all the allegations of child abuse in other states, and we didn't know everything about the withholding of food as punishment for the kids.
They evade authorities.
When a rat is cornered, he'll do anything to get out of that situation. And that analogy is, I think that these two women felt cornered. I think that they might have been tired from running.
And thumb their noses at a system that's intended to protect children.
Each of the system had their hand in what happened to those children.
And there were stops all along the way of the Hart family story that could have prevented its ending here at that cliff. Stops in Texas, in Minnesota, in Oregon, and in Washington. And the story will require a few more examinations of that photo of Devante Hart from the Portland protest in the arms of Portland police officer Brett Barnum. Because that photo is likely not at all about a boy moved to tears by racial tension or social unrest. It's likely those tears were a desperate, quiet plea for help in front of his mother, the one responsible for his death. Devante Hart was blinking twice because he was in trouble, and no one was noticing. Next time on Deviant.
I don't know exactly what they said, verbatim, but one of them was like, will 500 milligrams of Benadryl kill a 120-pound woman? What over-the-counter drugs can I take to OD? Is death by drowning relatively painless? How long does it take to die from hypothermia while drowning in a car?
Until next time, thanks for listening. Deviant is executive produced by Clark Goldman, Dan Semitovich, and me, Andrew Iden. Clark is our story editor and booker. The show is written and produced by me and Dan, with original scoring by Shuvo Sir. Sales, marketing, and distribution support comes from our partners at Gemini 13. Deviant is a production of Cold Open Media.